Good morning, afternoon, and evening to you all, and welcome. We are pleased to have you all here for the virtual side session Enabling Higher Wages for Garment Workers Through Purchasing Practices, Case Studies from Vietnam to Bangladesh, as part of the OECD Forum on Due Diligence in the Garment and Footwear Sector. This webinar is co-hosted by the Fair Labour Association and GIZ. My name is Miriam Keegan, and I am the Social Compliance Associate here at FLA, and will be your moderator for this session. I'm joined today by my colleagues, Director of Innovation and Development for Manufacturing, Tiffany Rogers, Director of Social Compliance and Accreditation, Feng Do, and Fair Compensation and Member Engagement Manager, Shema Azmi, who will each be sharing FLA's insights on the living wage pilot in Vietnam and the Living Wage Case Study project in Bangladesh on enabling higher wages through purchasing practices. We are also honoured to be joined today by leading experts in the field of living wages and purchasing practices. Introducing to you Executive Director of Global Worker Dialogue, Guy Stewart, and Project Manager for Living Wages and Purchasing Practices at GIZ Partnership for Sustainable Textiles, Anina Boos. You're both very welcome today. Today, we're diving into the collaborative efforts of various stakeholders who are working together to improve wages for workers in the garment and footwear sector. We'll be highlighting two exciting GIZ-funded projects led by the Fair Labour Association in partnership with GIZ's Initiative for Global Solidarity and the Partnership for Sustainable Textiles. These projects show how partnerships between brands and suppliers can promote fair wages and better working conditions for garment workers. We'll look at some case studies that shed light on the gap between legal minimum wages and living wages. We'll explore how responsible purchasing practices such as fair pricing, long-term partnerships, and predictable order volumes can help bridge this gap. And another key focus of our session will be the importance of integrating worker voices into wage-focused initiatives. It's crucial that their perspectives are at the heart of efforts to improve working conditions. So we'll also delve into the unique political and economic contexts in Vietnam and Bangladesh and how these factors influence wage policies and working conditions. Understanding these local dynamics is essential for grasping how wage progress happens and effective interventions can be. Finally, we will host a panel discussion where we'll discuss strategies for scaling and maximising the impact of these efforts, highlighting the vital role that brands play in driving positive change outcomes for garment workers. And there will be a short Q&A section to take any questions that you may have. So to begin, I will now hand you over to my colleague, Tiffany Rogers, who will provide you with an overview of the Fair Compensation Programme.
Thanks, Miriam, and welcome everyone to our OECD side session. I'm Tiffany Rogers, Director of Innovation and Development in Manufacturing from the Fair Labour Association. And I'd just like to say to you all happy Valentine's Day for those of you that celebrate. We're here to talk about something that really is for love and well-being of our workers, and that's living wage. For those of you that aren't familiar with the Fair Labour Association, we're a labor rights focused NGO. And we're a multi-stakeholder initiative. So we're made up of businesses, universities, and civil society organizations to really form the standards that can improve working conditions in the apparel, footwear, and agriculture sectors. And we're an organization that looks at all of those three stakeholder groups equally, and they form our board and our governance structures. We could go to the next slide. So I want to provide a little bit of background on the FLA's fair compensation strategy that sunsets at the end of this year. We've been on a 5-year journey that started it started before 2020, but our strategy solidified itself then and was approved by our board to really set out work for especially our business members to start with wage data collection. And so back in 2018, the FLA really made the effort to start to develop wage data collection tools that could be scalable for businesses and factories to understand how their workers' wages were comparing against living wage estimates. We started to use the Global Living Wage Coalition estimates and joined that coalition in 2022. Really because it was such a rigorous and transparent methodology that benchmarked how much workers needed to meet their basic needs and provide some discretionary income. Starting in 2020, all fair labor accredited companies were required to have a fair compensation blueprint. And what that means is it's an action plan that companies develop based on the wage data analysis and the living wage gaps that they have in their supply chain. And that analysis helps them prioritize where they have the largest gaps and where they can make the most improvements with things like sourcing leverage and other factors. That blueprint is also supposed to have accountability measures within their responsible purchasing practices and also articulate how they will continue to engage with civil society and workers to make progress. In 2022, all fair labor accredited companies are required to have a public commitment to fair compensation, and that should also include details of their implementation of their blueprint. And now where we are now for the past couple of years, and with the help of GIZ's Initiative for Global Solidarity, we've been able to start projects to really figure out how to drive progress. How can brands and suppliers and workers make progress towards living wage? We've also started to think about what public reporting looks like and provided some guidance to our members that is publicly available on our website on how to use our fair compensation dashboard to improve wage transparency in their supply chains. And the FLA really made an effort to not only support our members on this journey, but also to support other companies who perhaps are not within the FLA, who don't have the resources to join our organization, but want to continue to make progress. So our wage data collection tool is free and publicly available on our website, along with the guidance for how to develop a fair compensation blueprint, examples of what the public commitments look like from our members, and also that living wage public reporting guidance. Next slide. So this is just a snapshot of our fair compensation dashboard. It's an online tool that our members can use, and we offer it to non-FLA members through a subscription service. And you can collect your wage data from your factories and then measure against other wage benchmarks like poverty lines, minimum wages, and living wage estimates like the GLWC estimate. I want to call out that around living wage. So with that, I'll pass it back to Miriam, and I'm really excited for you all to hear from our expert speakers on the living wage topic, and especially for you all to hear from Shema and Fung, who will talk about our projects in Vietnam and Bangladesh.
Thank you so much for that overview, Tiffany. Now it is my pleasure to pass it over to Anina Boos from GIZ, sharing her insights in the Initiative for Global Solidarity and the Partnership for Sustainable Textiles.
Thanks, Miriam, and a warm welcome also from my side. My name is Anina Boos and I'm representing the Gesellschaft für internationale Zusammenarbeit, GIZ, today. In fact, two initiatives that are being implemented by GIZ to put into context our involvement in the two projects presented in this session today. I would like to quickly give you an overview of the Initiative for Global Solidarity, IGS, and the Partnership for Sustainable Textiles, or short PST. We can move to the first slide, please. Thank you. So the Initiative for Global Solidarity, IGS, is a German development cooperation project acting on behalf of the German Federal Ministry for Economic Cooperation and Development, the BMZ, and implemented by GIZ. The objective of IGS is to improve the implementation of human rights and environmental due diligence among the private sector. So to do so, IGS encourages buying and supplying companies to collaborate as partners and share responsibility for compliance with due diligence. IGS focuses on issues such as purchasing practices, grievance mechanisms, but also circular practices. And currently it supports suppliers in partner countries to establish responsible business help desks, the RBH, to support suppliers to learn about and implement HREDD. And among others, partners with the FLA to implement projects on purchasing practices and wages. Next slide, please. So looking at the operational level, IGS is active in a multitude of countries, including in many textile producing countries in Asia. Globally, we partner with MSI, companies and civil society to promote HREDD, and locally we support the suppliers, labor unions and associations in building due diligence capacities. Next slide, please. The Partnership for Sustainable Textiles, PST, on the other hand, is a multi-stakeholder initiative established on behalf of the BMZ and brings together members from different stakeholder groups. So our members are united in the goal of a social and ecological textile and clothing industry. To make this transformation happen, we act collectively with a set of shared values and learn from each other. Next slide, please. So how do we do it? I won't go into much detail because today is about the living wage pilots. However, the PST is built on 3 pillars. And the one that is creating the framework for our joint actions is the 3rd pillar, addressing focus topics. In total, we are addressing 4 focus topics where we aim to work collectively with our members for transformation in the textile supply chain. And today, of course, focusing on the topic of living wages and purchasing practices. Next slide. As one of our joint actions, we are currently implementing a project in Bangladesh in cooperation with the Ethical Trading Initiative, ETI, focusing on supporting brands to develop individual strategies on living wages, as well as the engagement for local stakeholders such as workers, improving conditions for social dialogue, in our 3 implementation countries, Bangladesh, Pakistan, and India. In Bangladesh, we're combining efforts with the FLA, jointly organizing a buyer-supplier roundtable, bringing the multi-stakeholder dialogue to a sector level, engaging learnings, and possibly finding opportunities for scalable solutions. And with that, I'm handing over back to you, Miriam.
Many thanks, Anina. I'm now delighted to introduce you to Phung Do from FLA, who will be explaining now the Vietnam living wage pilot in more detail.
Thanks, Miriam. So hello, everyone. Very warm welcome to OECD Side section. I am Phung Do, the FLA Social Compliance and Accreditation Director. And on behalf of Fair Labor Living Wage Pilot Team, it is my pleasure to present you the great work that we had done in Vietnam. Okay, so before going to detail of the pilots, let's look at the wage chain analysis for this country, which was one of the background study for us to do the pilot. This slide shows you from 2015 to 2022 worker monthly net wage average from FLA member, and more than 500 factory datasets had contributed to this data. If you look at the graphic, you could see that from 2015 to 2017, from 2015, 2017 to 2019, the worker average net wage increased 23%, quite significantly. It had been slightly decreased during the COVID time, and in 2021, the living wage gap with GLWC, Global Living Wage Coalition, estimate is 18%, and by 2022, the gap was around 16%. It's also the time when the FLA started the living wage pilot in Vietnam. Please go to next. To understand the pilot, it is very important to talk about its background overview. There were elements that the FLA considered when doing the living wage pilot in Vietnam to make sure that we were prepared. First, as mentioned earlier by Tiffany, since 2020, we implemented Faircom strategy that FLA has been working with the company to improve the worker wage. Second, the 2021 FLA living wage case study had revealed that Vietnam was ready for the bigger work on the wage improvement. Moreover, during the pilot, we want to test the living wage intervention in multi-buyer facility, also drive the collaboration, partnership, and progress with the leader in the living wage movement. Please go to next slides. So let's move on to the partnership, which I can say is a key for the pilot success. Yes, we had great local partner who is a Vietnam Living Wage expertise, the Employment Research Center, or called ERC. ERC is also the organization that conduct Global Living Wage Coalition estimate for Vietnam for Anchor Institute. The pilot is funded by GIZ, as mentioned by Anina. Thanks to the GIZ, the organization that you already got the information. So joining the pilots is the global brand from the FLA, from the PST, and Fairwear. And last but not least, the most important partner is the supplier in Vietnam, where all the pilot activity happened starting from 2022 and will wrap up in middle 2024. Please go to next. I would like to brief you on the methodology that we use for the pilot. 2 factory and 8 buyers are supporting the living wage progress from reviewing purchasing and procurement, planning, production, compensation system, and HR system. The FLA and ERC conduct the wage data analysis using GLWC wage estimates, determine the living wage gap, lowest paid worker, and other wage change in overtime, and also the benefit. Worker is our project focus. During the field activity, worker interview provided the input into the pilot finding, and training was provided on the living wage concept and social dialogue. Worker perspective and well-being were considered for the training, identifying gaps and solution, benchmark improvement, and measuring impact after the pilot conclusion. And lastly, FLA, we provided buyer recommendation in addressing gap on the purchasing practices, reviewing FLA company, accreditation, evaluation, Fairwear brand check, and other report against the finding of the pilot from the factory. Next slide, please. As I mentioned earlier, workers are the main subject, so the pilot really focused on the worker engagement. For example, we conduct worker interview during field activity. We ask the worker or union consultation on the compensation system change. ERC tailor-made and provided worker training on the living wage and change to the compensation. And importantly, at the end of the pilot, during the final interview, we had worker survey for the impact data collection. I will talk more about the worker survey data analysis in the next slide. So now let's go straight to the topic that everyone wants to know. What improvement has been made on the purchasing practices? We are happy to notice that the brand partners are improving responsible purchasing practices policy, ensure costing practices support the right to the fair compensation. What happening is also the regular review to improve the costing practices and engagement with the supplier on this update. One of the improvement I wanted to call now is why the market demand and low peak season are very hard to manage. Company is supporting factory in product and material diversification, which greatly help factory on production balance. Can we go to the next slide? I think this slide is the most expected one. Together with the brand improvement on purchasing practices, factories are making great progress to improve worker payment, which was measured from our final assessment in end of 2023. We noticed that wage improved through the increase of the basic salary, allowance, benefit, defining skill level, and incentive pay. Besides that, comparing again the Global Living Wage Coalition estimate for 2023 in recent two, factory increased the lowest paid occupation from 5% to 15%. Additionally, new high in major occupation are now paid above the 2023 Global Living Wage Coalition Region 2 estimate. Also, during the regular production month, workers earn above the GLWC Region 2 estimate. Satisfaction survey analysis show workers who engage in compensation practice were satisfied, and almost all survey workers state that the compensation for regular work can cover the basic need and some saving. However, I also would like to indicate that wage during the low season continue to be a challenge to ensure the living wage progress is made. And lastly, also from the worker satisfaction survey, it showed lack of worker engagement on the compensation update impact their awareness and satisfaction in its employer compensation. And I think that these things bring us to a lot of action plan that we make in the future. And so next slide, which is also the last slide in my presentation, I would like to wrap up the presentation with the notable conclusion for the pilot. Maybe I only call out some of the highlights for the discussion. First, through the pilot, we recognize that supplier can make significant way progress. As I presented in last slide, how factory change in the payment system. But the key is buyers must improve how they support this progress with responsible purchasing and costing practices. Second, care about the worker. When costing is something kept by the sourcing and costing team, through the pilot, we realized that worker engagement on the compensation and standard unit value in the factory that we call SAM, SMA. Setting for the costing is crucial to ensure the costing realistic. And last but not least, while making change on the purchasing and costing is very hard, I bet everyone agree with the FLA that the brand can support supplier improving condition for the worker engagement and social dialogue. And we strongly recommend you keep doing that. And with that, I hand it over back to Miriam. Thanks everyone for listening.
Fung, thank you for this, and apologies for the slides. So to move the pin to another important location in the garment and footwear sector, I will now introduce Shema Azmi from FLA, who will provide an overview of the Bangladesh project for you.
Thank you, Miriam, and welcome everyone. I'm very happy today to talk to you about our living wage project in Bangladesh. And before I start talking about the project itself, I want to give a little bit of background information. Early 2024, we published wage data trends for Bangladesh, which are based on wage data collected by our member companies from 2018 to 2022. What the report showed is that after the previous minimum wage update in 2018, there was quite a high increase in average wages of about 42% in 2019. And after that, the wage pretty much stagnated year over year. And this means that the living wage gap increased year over year until it reached almost 52% in 2022. So essentially what this means is that in Bangladesh, average wages do not increase significantly unless there is a minimum wage update. And average wages have trouble keeping up with the inflation rate. And that makes it very difficult for workers. So with this background in mind, we started the Bangladesh project, and I think we can go into the next slide. Yes, so the project is funded by GIZ's Initiative for Global Solidarity, and we are also coordinated with the Partnership for Sustainable Textiles and the Ethical Trading Initiative. because they are also doing a parallel project on wages in Bangladesh. And we are partnering with Global Worker Dialogue, an organization that really specializes in worker voice, and their local research organization, RAPID. We have 7 global brands representing FLA and PST participating in the project, 4 factories in Bangladesh, and we have INSYNC Global for local support with the factories. And in the next slide, yes, the project started in June 2024 and will end in April 2025. And essentially, we framed this project as a living wage case study project. What we mean by that is that the idea is really to gather information from multiple sources and identify what are the factors necessary to see wage growth in the specific context of Bangladesh. And here you see a series of activities that we're doing to gather this information. So the first thing is really to do the wage data analysis to understand what kind of wage progress happened prior to the 2023 minimum wage updates and understand what wage progress happened after the minimum wage updates. We're also testing the offsite worker interview approach with GWD. I won't talk about this too much because we have Guy who will speak after me at length about the worker interviews and the results from this project. And then we also evaluated the purchasing practices of the brands participating in this project using our own principles, the FLA principles, and the Common Framework for Responsible Purchasing Practices. And we, INSYNC Global, conducted on-site factory management interviews for 4 factories to understand really production systems at the factory, compensation systems, and also to gather insights from the factory directly on the brand's purchasing practices. And then finally, at the end of January, we were in Bangladesh to organize a roundtable that brought together buyers and suppliers for them to discuss some of the challenges that they face and start workshopping some action-oriented solutions based on purchasing practices. And in the next slide, I will hand it over to Guy, who will talk more about the offsite worker interviews in a bit. But before I do that, I want to quickly mention some of the key takeaways from the factory visits of the 4 factories participating in this project. The first key takeaway is that worker engagement will be necessary both when the factory is identifying what is the costing for the products that they're making. So, for example, as Fong mentioned earlier in her presentation, you can think about the standard minute values. So making sure that when the factory is identifying how long it takes to make a specific garment, they're also engaging with their workers to get their insights on that. Another thing that came to light in this project is that oftentimes in Bangladesh, factories work through an agent or they have their headquarters that are not in Bangladesh, outside of Bangladesh. And so when we did the factory visits, it was clear that the factory itself had quite little visibility on the purchasing practices of the brands they work with. And so our recommendation here will be to find ways to increase that visibility or even to create a channel for communication between the factory and the brand itself, particularly when there's an agent or intermediary involved. And then finally, the reliance on excessive overtime is something that we consistently found as well. So consistently, factories will do production planning based on 10 hours of work a day for 6 days a week. And that is, at least according to the FLA principles, the definition of excessive overtime. So this is not something that can be addressed overnight, but it needs to be flagged, and we're recommending that factories start implementing the foundations necessary to address that, And that is really through social dialogue, first and foremost, really being able to have this space where both workers and factory management can talk about even the concept of wages, and having that process supported by brands. And the next slide, I'm going to go quickly through this. This is some takeaways from the brand's responsible purchasing practices review. So here we are asking brands really to improve their responsible purchasing practices policy, and most importantly, incorporate their responsible purchasing practices policies in their fair compensation blueprint. The fair compensation blueprint is what we call internally at the FLA the action plan that all FLA member companies are supposed to create to close the living wage gap once they have done the initial analysis in their top sourcing countries. Another key takeaway is that brands need to support factories in worker engagement, and they also need to develop effective costing accountability policies and mechanisms. What we mean by that is that staff needs to be effectively accountable for the costing negotiations that they do with their suppliers, and to make sure that they're held accountable for prices that cover at the very least the cost of production of the products that they're acquiring. So that was a very brief overview of the Bangladesh project, and I will now hand it over back to Miriam.
Thank you so much, Shema. Next, we are delighted to have Guy Stewart from Global Worker Dialogue to speak to you about the work that they have done on off-site interviews in Bangladesh.
Great, thank you, Miriam. Next slide, please. So as part of the effort to increase wages, there needs to be a way in which you can track progress. And in the absence of good government data or extensive trade union representation in the factories, and in the absence of good social audit data, the most effective way of tracking wage progress, or an effective way of tracking wage progress, is through talking to workers directly, off-site, away from the factory, in a place where they feel comfortable, and in a process where they have trust in the person they're talking with. And that's what we set out to, that's what Global Worker Dialogue has been doing for many years. And we wanted to just validate and test further our methodology against the data that FLA is collecting through its own wage data collection processes. So there were 4 factories selected, 2 in Gazipur, 2 in Chittagong, 75 workers per factory, so a sample size of 300. The factories were selected in partnership with FLA and with FLA members and, of course, the suppliers themselves. This is not a representative sample of factories across Bangladesh. We do have data from other factories, which we'll be using in our benchmarking. We were also able to validate our data against pay slips. We were able to collect pay slips from workers and use those to essentially validate the data that we collected directly from workers. Next slide, please. We've covered a lot of subjects in the interviews, not just looking at living wages, but the one I'm going to focus on are hours and wages. It's important when looking at wages to also discuss hours. Chaimi has already alluded to that, in the sense that in Bangladesh there's a high reliance on overtime and excess overtime in Bangladesh. And so in order to understand wages, you need to understand the number of hours that people are working to earn those wages. Next slide, please. So in Bangladesh, we collected data covering October and November 2024. During those months, a regular work month in October is 208 hours, and in November 200 hours. And you'll see that in both months across the 4 factories, there was a fair amount of overtime being worked. There was some slight differences between Chittagong and Ghazipur, but generally overtime worked in both regions. Next slide, please. One of the things that we found very quickly was that 3 of the 4 factories were had overtime that was not excessive, in the sense of the law in Bangladesh is that you can work 8 regular hours, 2 hours of overtime, and then anything beyond that is considered excess work hours, essentially violating the labor laws. There was one factory that clearly was having workers work many more hours than allowed by the law. The other factories, in almost all weeks and all months of the data collection, were within the normal overtime parameters. Next slide, please. Monthly wages during this period, overall across the 2 months, just under 17,000 taka a month. Slightly more wages earned in October than November, and that was due to overtime. And there's definitely a difference in earnings between Chittagong and Ghazipur based on other data that we've collected in past years. Chittagong has a premium of about 10 to 15% over the satellite areas of Dhaka and Dhaka itself. Next slide, please. Again, if you look at the data by factory, factory 2, that's the factory that was having people work a lot of overtime. They had the highest wages. So although they were in many other cases where we've looked at these data, when people work excess overtime, they often don't get the reward from that excess overtime in terms of wages. But in the case of factory 2, at least you're seeing high wages as a result. I should note that the living wage calculation around 23,000 taka a month in 2023. It's probably now 25,000 taka a month given inflation. So even with excess overtime, Bangladeshi workers were falling short of that amount. Next slide, please. We always calculate wages in terms of hourly wages. This is a way to account for the fact that workers are working a lot of hours, a lot of overtime and excess overtime. And when you calculate that, the hourly wage, we see that in the 4 factories we were looking at, that 75 taka an hour was the regular, was the wage that they were earning. And this compares very favorably to what we found in a March 2024 survey, where we found that workers were earning around 62 taka an hour. Now, because of the Chittagong premium, we have to temper or make some adjustments to that 62 taka per hour number, because that 62 taka per hour number was based on data collection in the Dhaka region. If we make an adjustment for Chittagong, it's probably more around the 70 taka an hour would have been what we would have found from all the factories. So that still means that in Chittagong, the factories we were focusing on were paying more than other factories in the area. So generally, the factories that we are studying are paying more. Next slide, please. And again, there was some variance across the factories, some of it due to the Ghazipur Chittagong difference. Factories 1 and 2 are in Ghazipur, factories 3 and 4 in Chittagong. And you'll see that the highest pay was in Factory 4 in October 2024 at 83 taka an hour. So there is, one of the takeaways here is that there are factories that are paying higher wages than the norm. Next slide, please. So let's look at the pay gaps, and looking at the pay gaps in terms of gender, in terms of the living wage, in terms of timeliness of pay, and also looking at pay slip and survey data and comparisons between the two. So next slide, please. In terms of gender, living wage, and timeliness, we didn't see a discernible difference in pay, men versus women. This was a surprise to us. Normally we see a pay gap in Bangladesh. It's normally about 4 or 5 taka an hour. There may be something to do with the sampling, the mix of workers we have, and the mix of workers across factories. When we look inside the factory and compare men and women within the factories, there are some differences that emerge, but they're not clearly biased one way or the other. So, and also grade level makes a difference, and because of the small sample size, it's very hard to discern exactly what's going on. But normally, when we look at across a factories with a sample size of 300, 500, we normally see a gender pay gap. So something is going right in these factories in terms of gender equality. There is a living wage gap, and a large one, 35% gap. And these are in factories that are paying better. The way we calculate the living wage gap is we look at what workers would have earned in a 48-hour week. That's the regular week in Bangladesh. So we make some adjustments to what they actually earned, taking out overtime and excess overtime, and what they would have normally earned. And they would have earned 15,200 taka a month if they had just worked 48 hours. And that's well short of the 23,000 taka a month estimate in 2023, probably now around 25,000 taka a month. All workers generally reported being paid on time. One of the things that I should note is that Factory 2 with the high overtime did not distribute pay slips to workers. The other 3 factories did, and we were able to see the pay slips distributed to the other factories, but Factory 2 does not distribute pay slips to workers. And this is an important finding in terms of the role of transparency in promoting living wages and reducing excess hours. Next slide, please. So when we did an analysis of the data we collected directly from workers against the data that we saw on pay slips, we found we had some interesting findings. We had 517 photos of pay slips from workers. The workers gave us permission to take photos of their pay slips. And we were able to then analyze the results of what we saw on the pay slips. And not surprisingly, the wages reported by workers to us in the survey matched the wages on the pay slips. And that's because workers were often referencing the wages and the pay slips when they were answering our questions. In terms of work hours was a bit of a better test of our methodology, because we asked workers about how many hours they worked every week, because that's the best way to get workers to respond accurately. But the work hours are not calculated in total on the pay slips. You get the number of days they work plus their overtime. And of course, you only get it reported at the end of the month. So workers are not looking at a pay slip every week to see what their hours were. And what we found was that 86% of the time, the numbers that workers gave us and the numbers on the pay slips matched within 10%. So a pretty accurate, a pretty good validation of the methodology we've been using to gather data from workers. Next slide, please. I'm not going to go through these slides quickly, but I'm going to go through these slides quickly, but just we have some cost of living and household needs, and we have a lot of data on this. But next slide, please. In terms of household spending, Chittagong spending is higher than in Ghazipur, and also the rents in Chittagong are higher than in Ghazipur. So, and one thing to note about both of these numbers is that workers are not earning a living wage, but they are surviving. And the way that they survive is they have poor quality food, and they live in very poor conditions. And so the rents that they're paying are relatively low, but what they're getting for those rents are extremely hard conditions. A room that's 2.5 meters by 2.5 meters with one door, one window, shared kitchen, shared bathroom, no real privacy. And that is not what the workers want, because we've talked to workers about this and they've expressed their desires for much better housing that would cost probably at least twice as much as what they're paying right now in rent. Next slide, please. And then workers all expressed concern about rising wage expenses. They all reported that they received an increase in their wage in December 2023 in response to the minimum wage board regulations, and that there was an increase in their ability to make ends meet after receiving that wage increase. There was another wage increase in 2024. We don't have data from that after that wage increase, but I've got some ideas about how we can collect that data in the next few months, and so we will be able to report out to you later on in the year on the extent to which the new wage increase has actually had an impact on workers. So bottom line is that in order to move towards a living wage, you need to track your progress. And to track your progress, you really need to talk to workers directly, and you need to talk to workers about wages and about hours. There's no point in having progress towards living wage if the only way you achieve it is through excess work hours. It needs to be a validated hourly wage increase that translates into a living wage. Thank you very much. And skip those slides. Those were extras.
Thank you very much, Guy, for your presentation about this impact of the worker interviews having, and what impact it has on enabling higher wages. And just to conclude, we are now going to pass it back to Shema, who will speak on the importance of worker engagement and responsible purchasing practices.
Thank you, Miriam. I think we can already go to the next slide. Yes. So very quickly, because we have a very interesting panel right after, I just want to wrap up by saying that living wages are very complex, and I don't think that's news for anyone in this webinar. So our projects are very much focused on suppliers and brands because they both have responsibility towards achieving higher wages. Suppliers are responsible for workers' wage policies and practices, and brands, on the other hand, are responsible for fair purchasing practices and long-term support. So they have a shared responsibility, but that's not all that goes into achieving higher wages and ultimately reaching living wages. There are other elements that will play a huge role in whether or not a country will achieve living wage standards. You have labor laws and regulations, you have economic stability in the country, and you also have industry alignment because individual actions from suppliers and brands are quite limited in what they can achieve. And then you also have social dialogue and collective bargaining. And I want to focus a little bit on social dialogue in particular, because we talk about worker engagement and we talk also about buyer-supplier dialogue. And I just want to stress why this is important. In the framework of responsible purchasing practices, brands and suppliers should be talking to each other, but not just in a transactional way. They should be having dialogue to really understand mutual challenges they're going through, and then do collaborative problem solving. And this dialogue really needs to be supported by worker voice. The presentation that Guy gave was a good example of why you need to have that input when you're having that discussion with your supplier as a brand. And you can use worker grievances as a source for that information, but you can also use worker surveys and rely on organizations like GWD, for example, to get that insight from workers. And there also needs to be social dialogue between suppliers and their workers. And here, what we mean by this is really creating space for discussing living wages between factory management and workers. Oftentimes, international NGOs or even brands, we come with this concept of living wages, and we don't really give space for factories and workers to discuss that, to understand what it means for them locally. I think that requires time and really building trust. And because it's a difficult process, brands should be supporting this process. So I want to end with that, and then I will hand it back over to Miriam.
Thank you, Shema, and thank you to everyone who has presented so far. We are now moving on to the next part of this webinar, and here we're going to have a panel discussion on the role that responsible purchasing practices and worker engagement have in driving wage progress. And alongside Guy and Anina, joining us on the panel discussion today is Veronique Rocher, the Senior Director of Sustainability at Puma. We have Robert Helwig, CSR and Supply Chain Manager at Ortavox. And finally, we welcome Saeed Yusuf Mahbub Ali, Managing Director of Park Bangladesh Company Limited. So to begin, one second. So, to just get to set the scene for this panel, I not only want to just introduce you, but also to just get an understanding of the individual experiences that you've had being part of these projects. So I want to start with Robert. Could you briefly just describe the involvement in the Vietnam Living Wage Project and share what motivated your participation in this initiative as well?
Thanks for inviting me to this panel. So as presented earlier in this discussion, it has been a joint project with many other much bigger buyers at one shared supplier. And as Ortavox is committed to work on wages in its supply chain since a long time, we try hard to build up a comprehensive wage monitoring system and to implement open costing at all tier 1 suppliers as a base for long-term wage increases. So as we are a rather small brand, we are really focused on collaboration with other brands and suppliers. And so we learned about new strategies in the project as well. So before, we focused on labor minute calculation and the related cost. And this approach has been unfortunately ineffective in the past. So we learned to consider supplier development as a tool for achieving higher wages. And our role in this project was to support our suppliers in ensuring that the wage system incorporates work engagement as well for the cost calculation and to focus on actual cost in these calculations. So we try to support the supplier in developing an understanding of the importance of social dialogue, especially when it comes to wages and costing, and to have a real cooperation to build capacity, to increase also the worker skills, for example.
Thanks, Robert. And I just want to then pass it to Veronique. You know, you were based in Bangladesh with the case study in Bangladesh for living wages, and I'd love to just hear your involvement in that and share what motivated your participation in that initiative as well.
Yes, thank you, Miriam. I'm gonna echo a little bit what Robert said, but um, the project kicked off in June, so right, it's so not possible yet to see outcome, but maybe I can explain how Puma has been working and what was the motivation behind to join this specific project. So living wage has been in our agenda since 2020 for 2025 goals. Now we launch our 2030 goals, where definitely living wage is there, where we wanted to see a progressive wage level towards living wage. So how we've been working is that we had focused mainly on the strategic tier one, collecting their wage data in a way that we can upload them easily into fair compensation dashboard. And as Tiffany explained, we can actually really see the income of the wages, excluding overtime premium, towards the industry average, meaning that we can see on aggregated level the average of all the brands, factories, wage data in that, which can be a first milestone for improvement. And we can also compare those wages towards living wage, global living wage coalition benchmark. And then we sit with our sourcing and then decide together on the next steps. So this is where after that we engage with Fair Wage Network that will do an assessment into that is including not only factory management, but also workers' voice on how wages are perceived from different principles. And then after that, we also engage on remediation work together with Fair Wage Network. So we have seen progress in China, Vietnam, Cambodia when we see about progress towards living wage. Bangladesh, we've been reporting year after year that yes, there is a cap towards living wage, and I think you also have seen those data from FLA.
Yeah, absolutely.
So yeah, so we're not nothing special here. So what we want from this is to really understand, and I see the case study as a really important work because it's a learning process to really see what are the combination of different factors, because it cannot be only one factor to really see how we can really progress wage level in Bangladesh. And as Robert said, I mean, for us, it will be the first time where we will be able to collaborate with other brands as well, instead of, working together with one-on-one together with our factories. So it's a learning process that we wanted to get. And then for our participating factory, having that open dialogue also together with them, because we are collecting feedback on our responsible purchasing practice, but not necessarily directly on one-on-one basis on how we can also support from our purchasing practice in that process. So it's again an open, a lot of open question yet, but I think the process would be extremely interesting.
Thank you. And just, I suppose, sticking with the term you used there was a learning process. I just want to turn it to Syed. Just could you share some background on Park and its work on living wages as well, please?
Well, yeah, thank you very much. I think my video has been switched off from your side. If you kindly.
Oh, I think we have.
Right. Here I am. Thank you very much. Thanks to everyone for inviting us in this panel. And I'm Saeed from Power Bangladesh Company. We are doing business into Bangladesh for last 10 years. Basically, we produce luggages and bags. Recently, we have expanded our business and started garments since 2022. Out of all the buyers, Puma is one of our valued buyers, and we do give due importance to the Puma and the Puma requirements. And besides the government's rules and regulations, we strictly try to follow the Puma Code of Conduct with due respect. At times, the requirements, though it surpasses the government's requirements, we try and fulfill that. This is the small introduction of the company. And then if you ask me why we have participated in this FLA program, I'd like to say that our management has, over the period of time, has experienced that the workers are the core resources for such kind of factories like we want. And we must give due importance to the workers' happiness and then satisfaction as far as their wages and their style is concerned. And our management do recognize that and give due importance to that. And I would like to thank Puma for introducing us with FLA and GIZ. Basically, we have your initial report and we're analyzing that. That gives a very deeper insight and giving us a way of thinking for futures, how to improve the worker's life. And we appreciate, our management appreciate this effort. And we'd like to thank the FLA and GIZ, especially the field workers, those who took a lot of pain in going door to door and having meeting with the workers, listening to their problems, and giving us a very useful and thoughtful suggestions for the improvement of the workers' life. Because we feel happy and satisfied workers is necessary for running a company, and they are the core assets. And if they are happy and healthy, they are going to increase the productivity. They are going to remain happy. It's going to increase the stability of the company, and we can have a good, fair business with our valued buyers.
Thank you, Saeed, and we really appreciate the feedback just from your perspective. It means a lot to everybody. And as we heard already today about the importance of worker engagement in enabling higher wages in the garment and footwear sector, I just want to dive a little deeper into this topic. So I'm going to begin with Guy. And as a key partner in the Bangladesh project, what insights can you share on the importance of incorporating worker voices into living wage initiatives?
Thank you, Miriam. So the incorporating worker voice is, of course, essential, as everyone I'm sure agrees. A lot of the question is, how do you do it? And in an ideal world, it would be through social dialogue, workplace committees, trade unions collectively bargaining with factories to establish good wages. But oftentimes, those structures are not in place, or workers do not feel a lot of ownership of those structures. And so there needs to be some alternatives available. And it's just not an either-or situation. You can have collective bargaining, social dialogue, and also, as I'm about to talk about, data collection from workers to support the positions being taken by in social dialogue or in negotiations. But what we do, and what I would recommend others do, is that you build a relationship with workers through a survey methodology that we use, which is repeated interviews over time, which builds up a relationship with the workers. And in that way, you can get high quality data because you're talking to workers every week, so you're able to help them to remember what their experiences have been that week, and so you can have a good record of that. But you also build a trusted relationship with them because you go back many times, and they appreciate the fact that you don't just come in, ask them a question, and then disappear. They really appreciate the fact that we repeatedly go back to them. And the third thing is we pay them for their data, and so that they in a sense have some basic agency in terms of being paid for their data. And it's through these methods where we can get very accurate data that can then be used either by brands to talk to suppliers, by government organizations that aren't collecting their own information to talk to regulate factories. It can also be used by trade unions in negotiations, and it can be used in a social dialogue context. But the important point is to get accurate, valid data from the workers about their experiences at work, including hours worked, the wages they're paid, any deductions that have been taken from those wages, and other experiences such as experiences of harassment, especially gender-based violence that women experience, and which can be also become part of the negotiation process.
Yeah.
So those would be the sort of the takeaways that we've learned from this project, but also we have been working on for a number of years.
Yeah, and the relationship with the workers is at the core of it all. And so, Saeed, how has Park then engaged with workers on compensation and its living wage efforts? You know, what has been some of the feedback that workers have shared? Oh,
I'd like to please to inform you that we are effectively engaged with our workers. We have welfare officers; those are trained and very educated, and they have very good relations with the workers. And that one term you use, the trust. So our workers, they do trust our management, the engagement of the welfare officers, and are very, very accommodative. They feel very easy to share their experiences and requirements with our welfare officers. One example I would like to give here that, see, in Bangladesh, if you have the experience, it's a very conservative society we have in our country. Normally, the women or the girls don't want to share their personal issues with other people. They would like to hide it, and then, but our engagement with the workers is such that we are issuing free sanitation. The free hygienic sanitary towels to the workers wherever they need. So they are so free that they can freely communicate with our workers and the doctors and ask them for the sanitary napkins that, well, in the factory I've come, I'm not prepared, but suddenly something has happened, so I need this, so something like this. So you can understand that the relationship we have with our workers are very, very open and very cordial. They don't hesitate to even share their personal issues with our officers, welfare officers, designated welfare officers, and doctors. We have dedicated 24 hours doctors, especially taking care of health of all workers, especially the pregnant women, and they frequently visit and get advice from her. We give them free medicine. And as I said, that we share everything, whatever they need, try and help them. This is, we want that the workers should be healthy so that we can get a good output from her. They live happily. A very happy worker, healthy worker can improve the productivity, that we believe in that. And then we would like to engage more and more as per the requirement of our value buyer, as well as our management feels that more engagement with the workers give us more dividend so
Yeah.
that we can look after them.
absolutely.
Another example I can cite that a group of workers came and they were requesting us that their children could not be admitted into the schools and colleges because of high tuition fee in their local areas.
It just
Immediately,
shows,
we took up the case with our authority, the BEBSA. BEBSA has a school and college within the campus. We talked to them and we ensured their admission of their children with 50% of tuition fees. Only we need to give a certificate from the company that he is a permanent employee of my company, with her ID or his ID. That's it. So this is how actually, we have enlarged our areas of communications with the workers and frequency of communications and engagement with the workers, so that worker feels we are part of them. We are not something alien from outside, and they can freely talk to us, share their problems with us, and we can really address those problems to improve their health condition, living conditions, and ensure their satisfactions towards the company and the management.
Yeah,
Thank
no,
you.
thank you. It really shows the relationship that you've built with the workers. So thank you for sharing all of that. And just to finish off the piece on just about worker engagement, Guy, I just want to turn back to you one more time on this. Is just how do you think brands and suppliers can better collaborate with worker organizations like GWD to ensure that worker voices are being integrated into their overall strategy for wage improvements?
So the simplest way to go about this is that if you are interested in talking to workers outside of the factory, engage with GWD or another research organization, and ensure a couple of things. One is that when the research organization engages with the workers, the process is not done through the factories, it's done outside of the factories. That includes recruiting the workers through community-based processes. So you don't go to the factory and get a list of phone numbers. You don't go to the factory and try and interview workers in the factory. You don't go to the factory to ask people to join the study. You go into their community. You talk to key informants, you talk to workers on the street, and you find workers who are working in the factories. And that's the beginning of the process. And you meet them in person. And through that, you're demonstrating that you're independent of any organization, that you are interested in collecting credible data from them. And by going back every week over a period of time, they see that you are serious about what you're trying to do, collect credible data from them. So those are the sort of the key elements in all of this. And as far as possible, try to make it I would highly recommend not to make this about an advocacy position. You're simply trying to collect clear, credible, valid data. And then the next step is to use those data and use the data either in the supplier brand discussions or the worker supplier discussions, or really a sort of a tripartite or more discussion of what wages should be. So that would be the way that I would recommend people approach this, at least from the sort of the surveying of workers point of view.
Yeah, thank you for that. And I suppose another important aspect of, not only being involved with the workers' engagement, but is also, to ensure that higher wages are not only like just recognized, but also achieved in the long term, is recognizing the role of responsible purchasing practices that companies and factories and on workers as well. So we've seen a rise in the importance of RPP through, I suppose, the common framework and the now drafting of the purchasing practices HRDD framework recently. So I want to begin this discussion with Robert and Veronique, and we might have a moment each to speak about it. But how do you view the role of responsible purchasing practices in driving wage improvements, and how these practices are applied in your respective roles and projects? Were there any major barriers that you've had to navigate within your company, and how have you overcome them? You want to start maybe with Robert?
Yeah, thanks. So we definitely see the role of responsible purchasing practices as a central pillar to build resilient supply chains, which also include adequate wage levels to, for example, reduce worker fluctuation and to keep qualified workers in the factories as well. So talking about the common framework for responsible purchasing practices, for example, there's principle 5 called sustainable costing. And by taking this framework, we focus on accountability, transparency, and cooperation. And in the respective project, we focused on transparent costing. So from our experience, especially Asian suppliers are sometimes less willing to participate in open costing and share information about wage levels. We also try to focus on supplier engagement because we believe that open communication and collaboration is the best way to improve wage levels together. And of course, in the project, we also have this root cause analysis to find the reasons for prevailing wage levels and to discuss different possibilities to approach these root causes. So Autovox is working on living wages since many years, and on our journey, we definitely found some challenges we needed to overcome. The first and maybe one of the biggest challenges is the internal buy-in. So to align internal structures and conflicting interests. I think the most common conflict between margin targets and living wage demands is obvious. And to overcome this hurdle, we integrated the former CSR topic of increasing wages into our procurement department in order to shift responsibilities and to create a better accountability for this issue. Second, we also needed the supplier commitment and understanding, which is pretty important in order to ensure effectiveness of living wage efforts. Because if suppliers only have the impression that they are pushed to participate in such projects, there will be no long-term integration of these practices.
Yeah.
And third, we would need also to ensure traceability of wage payments to ensure that the effectiveness of wage increases or that wage increases in general lead to higher wages and not only to increased landed cost for the buyer. In general, I can say that through collaboration between the FLA, the participating brands, and the supplier, we were able to build capacity through supplier trainings as well, and increased the understanding of the supplier's situation regarding wages on our end.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you. And Veronique?
Yeah, so Puma has set a responsible purchasing practice in 2019, and then of course in coordination and support from FLA to be sure that we are really setting up according to FLA standards. I think this is definitely a way to be more transparent on what we aim at doing as a company, to also for our suppliers to be aware. But also, I mean, we have been talking about workers' voice, but it's also important to give supplier voice where they have a platform where they feel comfortable also to bring their feedback on brands' purchasing practices that they have observed, because definitely this have an impact, domino effect on working hours, wages, with a lot of different, maybe also health and safety, increase injury rates and so on. So there is a lot of replication on how brands are actually purchasing business relationship with their suppliers. So we use the Better Buying survey to definitely get feedback. So it's anonymous. It's safe for suppliers to be very open. We have a pretty straightforward feedback. And then, of course, we work together with our sourcing, who are actually sometimes recognizing some areas for improvement, and sometimes maybe not really clear if it's only the supplier perception or if there is anything that we need to improve in our communication. But this creates a platform for internal discussion, setting up an action plan, and also engaging with other key functions in the company for them to be aware that this is the kind of feedback we get from our suppliers. So this is what we would expect you to do. So over time, I think it helped to build trust and build long-term relationship with the suppliers. And again, I mean, It's not one-time action. It's a constant engagement, a constant, as you Guy explained on workers' engagement, it's the same from the suppliers to really get feedback on a regular basis and address those issues. Just to complement what Robert explained on challenge, I see the challenge about managing rising costs, right, including wage adjustment. That's a challenge our suppliers face, brands face. So I think what we have seen, at least in the context of Bangladesh, during the natural gas crisis, for example, where there has been a rising cost, we have seen that the supplier who had invested in energy efficiency program, in renewable energy solar panel, has been really able to absorb the cost. So cost-saving measures are really critical, and operational efficiency are critical for suppliers as well to be able to navigate in this movement all the time.
Yeah, thank you.
So,
Sorry,
yeah, sorry.
we're sure if we're just a bit short of time, so we might come back
Oh,
to
sorry.
the end of that point if that's okay, towards the end. But I just want to just finish this with Saeed, just understanding, I suppose, that building of trust, as Veronique just mentioned. You know, like how important is it for the brand's purchasing practices, such as the fair pricing and the long-term relationships and predictable order volumes as well, you know, in enabling you to achieve higher wages for workers' side. Just if you have just a quick point on that.
Thank you very much, Mariam. What Veronica said, I fully agree with her. We are at our level, we are fully transparent, and then whenever there is some audits or some inquiries or any data requested by our value buyer, we provide them whatever we have. We don't hide anything. And then this trust, transparency and the trust has built a good, I think, the good relationship between the Puma and our company. And those are dealing with Puma at the headquarter level. I think they have a very trustful relationship with them. And as I said, Veronica said to go for the green energies. Yes, we have set up the solar panel on their advice, and now we are being benefited with that. So my point would be that we sit down together and we set up the negotiations and win-win situation so that we can work together for a longer period of time, and we both are benefited, and at the same time our workers are also get benefited in the process.
Thank you, Saeed.
Thank
And
you.
thank you very much. And I suppose the important question now is that we're all thinking is, what's the next? The case studies and the pilots, they show us what can be done, but the major challenge now is of scaling and maximizing that impact. And it's something I just want to discuss a bit further. So I'll just go around just very quickly to everyone, just to kind of get a kind of what do you think is next coming? So Guy, in your experience, what is the most effective way to ensure that the workers' voices, for example, are genuinely heard and incorporated into wage-related projects?
So from our perspective, the role that an organization like GWD can serve, and a role that a worker survey can serve is very simple, is simply to create an independent source of data that can tell everyone what the situation is now and measure progress in the future. This could be a function of government. It doesn't have to be an NGO, but often the resources and the capacity is lacking, and so organizations like GWD step in to kind of fill that gap. The other point I'd like to make is that if brands and suppliers and others get together, this is not an expensive proposition. It can be covered through, if people act collectively. We've actually collected nationally representative sample data from workers in Bangladesh for many years, and it can be done. It just needs some coordination and resources. But ideally, we wouldn't be doing this. This would be done by government, and there would be good regulation on transparency around wages.
Yeah, thank you. And just then, I suppose from the brand's perspective, Robert and Veronique, if you just want to briefly just say, how you believe that brands can then scale their efforts to drive the wage improvements beyond just a single project or a supplier. So Veronique, I might start with you this time, because I cut you off short the last time.
And
So
I'm
just
gonna be short.
thank you.
So I see first is about brand commitment towards living wage, a public commitment, right? I mean, the way you feel the most comfortable with, I think that's a way to also get the buy-in internally, as Robert was mentioning, for example. Then the second is definitely to keep that open dialogue with the suppliers. So and experiment, because I see this project in Bangladesh as a case that is for us to understand what do we need to do next. So what I have promised to Said is in this project that whatever we're going to learn and whatever you're going to implement, we're going to also ask other factories to implement as a learning curve, also to really come a little bit at a bigger scale.
Yeah.
But what I see is also critical is to have the national constituent in that discussion as well, because it's not about only one brand, one supplier relationship. It's a more national level that needs to be done. So the work that has been initiated by AFA and FLA to actually start the open discussion with national constituent here is also very critical, because we also, the biggest worry for our suppliers when we talk about living wage is to lose this competitiveness, right? So it should be a fair play, a fair game for all suppliers.
Yeah, thank you. Robert?
Yeah, in this context, it's worth to know that Otterbox is a rather small brand with often lower buying volume, and therefore we need definitely strong and long-term buyer relations, which foster real improvements based on mutual trust as a foundation. In the long term, we thought of incorporating this in the supplier selection as well. So to select suitable suppliers which are intrinsically motivated to work on these topics and which see the benefits for themselves regarding the current labor market situation and rising sustainability demand by brands, where suppliers are really, really need to deal with these topics in the long term. But in the short term, we really don't want to push our suppliers, but rather reward our suppliers, which are progressing by their own motivation and are in compliance with the regulations and our values. So these suppliers are more likely to receive production programs for the future, as we are recognizing these aspects in our supplier evaluation as well. So we really want real cooperation instead of carrots and sticks. And for us, it's okay to be not the perfect supplier in the beginning, but the suppliers need to have the right mindset to work on these issues. Furthermore, we also need a scalable approach when it comes to the collection of wage data. This is why we had a lot of talks with the SLCP to integrate wage data in the HIG FSLM questionnaire. And so we can have a scalable approach to collect this data. So at last, I'd like to say that we also support freedom of association, social dialogue, and collective bargaining agreements, because we believe that capacity building regarding these topics by trainings, for example, is vital to push these topics forward.
Thank you, Robert. Yeah, and just then when turning back to Said on this, with what is, I suppose, one of the major lessons that you've learned from trying to scale this wage improvement and the most critical factor in sustaining this long term? Just very quickly, if you're able to just give me an insight into that.
Thank you very much, because through this discussion I have learned that basically some of the initiatives we have been taking at our level, but this needs to be enhanced and then increased to a substantial level. For that, we need support from the buyers and the brand, and at the same time, I think as Guy Stewart has said, that it needs higher involvement and the government involvement also through this discussion and dialogue to increase the wages, because now we have the sufficient data and informations. And at our level, we can assure you that we always remain transparent in sharing any information required for our buyers, and we have all the respect and honor for the code of conduct. And we are trying at our level to take care of all those issues so that our workers can live happily, safely, and they can be looked after in all way possible by supplier. But at the same time, I'd like to have the effective engagement by the brand as well as FLA and the governments so that we can reach up to the expected level. Thank you very much. Thanks a lot. I have learned a lot.
Thank you, Syed. And just before I finish up this Q&A, I just want to ask, bring Anina back into the conversation. And just, Anina, from GIZ's perspective, being an MSI, what are the key factors in driving the sustained wage improvements, in your opinion?
Yeah, I try to be very quick on that. So speaking today from an MSI perspective, I mean, the critical role of brands and their purchasing practices and achieving positive wage outcomes cannot be overstated. However, the years have also shown that to move this forward, we need collaborative approaches such as those fostered by MSIs, as well as mandatory due diligence obligations, including purchasing practices, to create that level playing field. Against the burden of reporting for both brands and suppliers, as well as regulators, we need common points of reference, such as, for instance, the common framework for RPP, and a harmonization on accountability mechanisms to be able to demonstrate progress on RPP and wages, but also on tools used by supply chain actors, for instance, on costing. The more we align as an industry and ensure that these guidelines and tools work well together, the more effective they will be. And as Robert also mentioned, I think it also requires collaborative efforts across initiatives, both to enable more brands to work together to increase their leverage and therefore maximize impact, but also to take discussions on a sector level, as in the case of our project in Bangladesh. And last but not least, I mean, we heard it today, meaningful engagement with local stakeholders such as workers and trade unions is needed to drive sustainable wage improvements. So it is essential that workers are involved in shaping RPP and to create better conditions for social dialogue. Trade unions need to be given the space to make their voices heard. And brands can support this by working with civil society organizations as part or through MSIs, using their network of local trade unions and organizations. And for instance, by signing global framework agreements to show their commitment and their support for both unions and suppliers. So yeah, just quickly giving my perspective on that. I hand over to you, Miriam. Thank you.
Thank you, Anina. It's very valuable, your insight into that. And, you know, so as we're nearing the end of this session, and there might be still some questions in the Q&A that we might be able to answer. But I just was also, as we conclude this panel, I want to just welcome Chi Do to the stage, just to speak briefly with us. So Chi has been working as a keen labour researcher, trainer and consultant for 20 years and is an author of many studies on labour relations and living wage, as well as the leading the Global Living Wage Coalition estimate, works for Anchor's Institute in Vietnam, and we're delighted to have her here to speak with us today.
Thank you so much, Miriam, and also thank you, FLA and the organizers for inviting me to join this exciting and very interesting, insightful panel. And as Phương also shared about our work in Vietnam, I had the chance to also join the first part of the pilot. And I just want to echo what have been discussed by the speakers and the panelists. And also, which has been highlighted by the title of this side session, is that responsible purchasing practice and worker engagement are the key to successful living wage initiatives. So when we first started our work on living wage, we thought that the suppliers' resistance would be something that is the biggest challenge. But what we found out throughout the project is that the suppliers can be cooperative, but we need the workers' voice to understand what the workers really view or see living wage in their own context, and the workers' voice in setting up the SAM, which is the minute costing, the target, the basis for calculation of their wages is super important. And then it comes back to the original, the brands, the buyers. We can see in many cases in which the buyers can be very committed at the beginning, but they will face with a lot of challenges in the end of the living wage commitments. So in order to to make sure that the living wage initiatives will be successful and also fair for all the stakeholders involved, I believe that the buyer's commitment from the beginning to the end is super important. So I just want to congratulate everyone on these excellent projects, and I'd love to see future initiatives to continue with these pilots. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Chi. Really, just very grateful that you've been able to join us today to give us that kind of final note on today's session. And as we wrap up this side session, I just want to thank everybody for joining today. To our speakers especially, and to my FLA colleagues as well. It's been a pleasure to be your moderator, and I hope that we'll all be able to meet again soon in the near future. And I wish you all a lovely day and to take care.